This episode, we're going to be talking vampires. Vampires are immortal beings that can only come out at night, and of course, they can only feast on human blood. I like to imagine vampires as the gothic, beautiful beings like the ones in Underworld, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about next. I love these vampires. They're aristocratic, elegant, and they can also kick some serious butt. Naturally, they've lived for thousands of years, so they've acquired some pretty good combat skills, but of course, they need the weapons to match. Who are they fighting, you might ask? Well, not humans, of course. Vampires are at the top of the food chain in this world. But werewolves, or what they like to call them, lycans, which apparently actually aren't the same thing, but you'll learn that if you watch the film. This film follows Celine, a beautiful vampire played by the ever-beautiful Kate Beckinsale. Celine seeks revenge against the lycans for murdering her family when she was younger. She learns that the lycans are seeking a human named Michael, so she does a little investigating herself. She learns shocking truths about her coven, as well as her mentor and father figure, Victor. Of course, Celine and Michael fall in love. You have a beautiful human, you have a beautiful vampire. It's just what happens, and that's what makes this movie awesome. As much as this film is romantic, it's far more action-packed. A deeper storyline starts to emerge that makes the whole battle between lycans and vampires come out in one final battle war scene.
Something else escaped.
Everyone knew that this movie was just so good that they made 2 more, which I'm a big fan of as well. I one time watched all 3 in one sitting, and I don't regret it. Can't say that I do. This movie appeals to both female and male, bringing some love and action that I'm sure everybody can enjoy together. All right, now a film I'm sure we've all heard of that put Wesley Snipes on the map, Blade. This film, like Underworld, is full of action and has a lot of weaponry as well. Not so much of a love story, but still pretty entertaining. To give you a bit of a backstory, Blade is a half-vampire hybrid. His mother was bitten when she was pregnant, so he actually came out as a human, but a vampire. I don't know. He can walk in the daylight, but he still has to drink human blood, which obviously is something that is very conflicting for him. The biggest enemy is other vampires, and one in particular named Frost, who really just wants to dominate the human race. All the vampires know who Blade is. They call him the Daywalker. And if you guys can remember the very first scene, and if you haven't, you should check it out, it's one that is just full of blood, and he comes into this rave nightclub and he just kills everybody, but there's already so much blood because it's like spraying from the ceilings and they're just only there to kill humans. What ends up happening is that one of the vampires, Quinn, is so badly burned that humans think that, well, he's a human, and they bring him to the hospital. He regenerates himself by biting another doctor, whom Blade goes and saves. Of course, she's going to become a vampire, and she's trying to find a cure to stop that from happening. Her name is Karen, and Blade takes her back to his home, where we meet his mentor and weapon maker, Whistler. Blade takes this woman back, named Karen, where we learn again more about Blade, and we meet his mentor and weapon maker, Abraham Smith. I won't go into too much detail about the film, but I do remember really enjoying myself while watching it. These vampires are different than the ones in Underworld because they live more modern. There's a lot more high fashion involved. Being this film is from 1998, the effects in it are not the greatest. The last scene where Blade and Frost are fighting, he cuts him in half, and then this weird, gooey blood thing happens. It doesn't really look that gooey because it just looks like a computer animated thing, but I'm not going to judge them. There are 2 films following this original Blade, Blade 2 and Blade Trinity.
Here I am, Blade. Wesley Snipes.
Not know who you are.
Messing with!
This way!
Next, I don't even know how I stumbled upon this film as a kid, but I just know that I really loved it, and I probably shouldn't have watched it, but I turned out okay, right? Right. This is one of my favorite films, Interview with the Vampire. This film isn't like Underworld, and it isn't like Blade. It's actually very deep and dark. I would say it gives a pretty accurate depiction on what would happen to somebody if they became a vampire, and the real problems and truths that they would have to deal with. This film is based off an Anne Rice book with the same name. It has an all-star cast with Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, Antonio Banderas, Kirsten Dunst, and that's just to name a few. Other Anne Rice books have become movies as well, like Queen of the Damned. I would check that out too if I were you. This film follows Brad Pitt's character, Louis. Louis has a death wish. After his wife and son died, his life was just over. He was completely depressed and he wanted to die. For some reason, this attracted Lestat, who is Tom Cruise's character. Lestat bites him, leaving him half dead and making Louis basically plead to live again, and the only option to do that he has is to make him a vampire. At first he loves this, he loves being a vampire, but then after he kills one of his slave girls, he becomes completely distraught and depressed, frees all his slaves, burns his house down, and leaves Lestat very angry. Louis tries to leave Lestat and wanders into a dark alley where there is no humans because the plague has rid everybody. He does find a young girl there who is crying by her dead mother's bedside, and so he tries to comfort her, but he's just so thirsty that he ends up biting her. Lestat has been following him and turns the girl, almost tricking Louis into staying with them. What's interesting about Claudia is that she's a little girl vampire. So she's growing inside as a woman, but on the outside, she's a little girl. This eventually angers Claudia, and she's very mad at Lestat and tries to murder him. Now, you're probably wondering, how is it that somebody could kill a vampire if they're already dead? But if a vampire drinks already dead blood, then they can die. There's this really creepy piano scene where Lestat is playing the piano after having been thrown into the swamp and comes back to life by living off of swamp animals like gators and crocodiles and things like that. So he comes back and he's playing this creepy melody and he's just so angry with Claudia and Louis for doing that to him. They flee to Paris, where Louis and Claudia meet a coven, another vampire coven run by Armand, who is Antonio Banderas. Another interesting thing about these vampires is that they also carry some supernatural powers, like reading minds. In Armand's coven, there's another vampire who reads Claudia and Louise's mind and finds out that they tried to murder Lestat. I won't get into much further detail because this is a movie that you should probably just check out for yourself. It's very deep and dark and has a lot of hidden meaning into it. You could only imagine what it would be like for a 200-year-old vampire to be living, well, kind of living, and hate every second of it. If you want to stir your emotions a bit, I'd give this one a try. Next, we have a film that I'm sure none of you have really heard of. It's called Let the Right One In. It's a Swedish film, so there are subtitles, which I know might discourage some of you, but I find that European horror films are probably the best. They did remake this in Hollywood, but instead of calling it Let Me In. I haven't seen it, so I can't judge it, but I'm going to say it's probably not as good. What's interesting about this one is that the writer wanted to focus on the relationship between the 12-year-old boy and the girl, almost deeming this a romantic horror film. Oscar is a 12-year-old boy who is bullied at school, and Ellie moves in next door with an older man. Things start happening in the town, murders, people missing, and we end up learning that Ellie is actually a vampire, a 12-year-old girl who is a vampire. Oscar learns this, but he's not afraid or scared of her and actually believes that he loves her. Obviously, you begin to learn that this older man that Ellie lives with isn't her father, but in fact the one who comes to pick up the pieces after the messes that she's made. This film, of course, is nothing like Underworld, is nothing like Blade, and a little bit of like Interview with a Vampire because it's very dark and has some meaning into it. The ending is pretty surprising, and you're wondering the whole time how you didn't see it to begin with. Thanks for watching this episode of Movie Box. Tune in next time where we'll be talking about the Brat Pack.